Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Executive Director of Svenska Bildningsförbundet, Fredrik Gusev, is unfortunately ill today, so I have the great privilege to welcome you all to this event. My name is ANDREAS ELFVING, and I work as a political advisor here at Svenska Bildningsförbundet. As we just became full members of the European Liberal Forum just a few weeks ago, actually, it's a great joy for us to be able to host this event here right now. The topic, the future of the foreign policy of the European Union, is one that has become more and more important and more in the news, I believe, due to the events that have taken place recently. We're very happy to have such a distinguished panel with us today, one with wide expertise and also many opinions, I'm sure, on the subject at hand. So without further ado, I would like to invite SUSANNE HARTIG of the European Liberal Forum to say a few words of welcome as we begin.
Minister HAGLUND, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear Liberal friends, I'm very pleased to be here in Helsinki today. On behalf of European Liberal Forum, the ELF, I'd like to welcome you to this round table. ELF, European Liberal Forum, is a political foundation, and we are the foundation of the European Liberal Party, the ALDE Party, Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. Under the roof of this foundation, there are 38 liberal think tanks, political foundations, institutes from all across the European Union. Together we observe and analyze European public policy issues and aim at contributing to the debate and to European integration as a whole. Svenska Bildningsförbundet, our host here today, was recently granted, as Andreas said earlier already, full membership to European Liberal Forum. And we are proud, truly proud, to have you, Svenska Bildningsförbundet, among our members from now on, and I'm looking forward to future cooperation with you. Ladies and gentlemen, these days we celebrate the 10th anniversary of admission of 10 countries into the European Union on 1st May 2004. Today, these 10 states have achieved a high degree of integration, and after various transitory periods, they are now full members with all rights and obligations. Following the admission of Bulgaria and Romania in 2007 and of Croatia last year, the enlargement process came to a halt. Though, the engagement with neighboring countries in the East continued. With the intention to strengthen political and trade relations with 6 post-Soviet countries, Armenia, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, the EU established the Eastern Partnership Initiative in 2009. At the center of this initiative have been values including democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, as well as principles of market economy, sustainable development, and good governance. The 3rd Eastern Partnership Summit in Vilnius last autumn was marked by the unexpected withdrawal of Armenia and Ukraine from entering into further commitments with the EU. It is a sad fact that ever since, the crisis in Ukraine has been evolving and deepening nearly day by day. The EU seems powerless, and it appears that we all are. How can the EU effectively defend our interests in today's multipolar world? What is the EU's geostrategic approach over the long term? How can the EU engage constructively with global powers, in particular with Russia? I hope this roundtable today will contribute to answering these and other questions. Before I pass on the floor, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel to be with us today, and of course to thank Fredrik Gusev and you, Andreas, and the team of Svenska Bildningsförbundet for organizing this event on behalf of ELF. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas and Susanne. I'm Charlie SALONIUS-PASTERNAK, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this panel. I recognize you're here to listen to the experts, so I will try to keep my comments and my voice as little heard as possible. Quick word, though, so you know my background. I'm a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I've been there for almost 10 years already. I focus on transatlantic relations, U.S. and Nordic security and defense policy in particular. A few words about myself. First, we're going to hear short comments, presentations, 5 to 8 minutes from each of the panelists. Then, I've at least imagined that we'll have a discussion centered around 3 larger thematic areas. Within each discussion, I'd like to hear questions, comments, so it doesn't become a session where this side of the room talks for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then there are a few minutes for questions. And so you can imagine questions already based on the panelists' comments. I'd like to hear some things and discuss about what we call EU internal development. Another one is relations with other larger actors, since we're talking about a multipolar world. And then third will be how the EU can respond. Our first panelist, who will go down the list, is a Finnish Defense Minister, Carl Haglund. I don't think you need any more introduction than this. Of course, those that do not know, me and Kalle and a few others shared a great experience about 5 years ago, which is being candidates for the EU Parliament. With the record of the last 5 years in hand, I'm very glad to see that Kalle won and I didn't. So thank you. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and welcome on my behalf also to this building, because this is also the home of our party. We live 1 floor upstairs, even though our party board has its meetings only next door. So tomorrow morning at 7:30 I will be here to chair the party board. So this is an important building for us. So hence I feel very much at home, and I'm also very happy that the new chairman of Liberal International and HANNA wanted to join us here to discuss under the lead of Charlie, and I'm happy that so many of you are interested in today's topic. Allow me actually to go back to where Charlie started out, because 5 years ago, as he mentioned, I was elected member of the European Parliament, and at that point in time the External Action Services and this whole project with actually making Europe in foreign policy speak with one voice was very much under construction in a very important phase where the Lisbon Treaty was to come into force, and we were in a situation where the External Action Service would actually be born and the new High Representative would get a stronger role than before. I had the pleasure to follow this process very closely, mainly because I had a role in the budget committee at the time that followed the practicalities around this, but also to see, of course, how the political work with even stronger common voice started out. We, of course, had before that already had Javier Solana and the activities together, but still we were at a phase where we had a very good debate around whether and how the European countries should act together, both at that time and even more in the future. Back then, I must say that I was somewhat maybe disappointed that the heads of states, in the end, in the fall of 2009, decided to appoint Baroness Ashton, whom I appreciate. However, you could see that it very much at the time showed that the member states did not actually want to focus on a common and actually emphasize the common foreign policy, and one chose to have fairly, let's say, not very high-profile politicians who took the lead of this common foreign policy. This, frankly spoken, even though I think that Baroness Ashton over the years have done a good job, and especially in building up the administration as such. But at the same time, I think the crisis in Ukraine now shows very clearly why Europe needs to be able to speak with one voice, and why we, Finland and many other countries that wanted this to become reality, were on the right track, let's say 10, 15 years ago when this debate started for real within the European Union. Coming over to the situation in Ukraine, following it very closely on a daily basis, as of course many others, we are very, very concerned. At the same time, the problem is, as some of us know who followed the discussion, that Europe's contribution to the crisis has mainly been this gravely concerned discussion where Europe is mainly concerned and gravely concerned, but not really being able to do much more than being concerned. We have sanctions of economic nature that have had a certain impact on the crisis in my evaluation. However, we can see that Russia still wants to or prefers to have a dialogue together with the Americans rather than the European Union. We have to admit, even though it might not be the right time right now, that the Eastern Partnership, which was mentioned here in the introduction, and the policies striving to integrate Eastern European countries to the Union has not been too successful. We have to admit that the situation where Yanukovych put the European Union last year ahead of the Vilnius summit, which then ended up with a catastrophe politically, and actually also now in the end one could even claim that the civil war, which we're more or less seeing already by now in eastern Ukraine, is partially a failure also of the European Union, even though I don't think one should blame the European Union where we are, but still the European Union has to at some point also do some sort of self-evaluation of why we ended up here and what we could have done better. One can of course say that it wouldn't have helped because there was a very big disapproval with the policies of the former president of Ukraine, but still this is also something that once again proves that we are on the right track. We're trying to speak with one voice, but we have a lot of policy failures. We can see now through the crisis that it hasn't been that easy to agree on common policies, etc. So we have a lot of work to do, and these are the themes I'd like to discuss together with the other panelists and you today. So I think I'll wrap up here with my main message being that Europe definitely needs to be better at speaking with one voice in the future. We are on the right track, but we have a lot of work to do in the future.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Already some questions in my own mind at least. I'll hold on to them and move on to Dr. JULI MINOVES. Freshly minted, I guess is the right expression, president of Liberal International. And I understand you have a familiarity with Finland from your past also as an ambassador. Maybe that insight will come in discussions. Please.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. I was ambassador to Finland, non-resident, but I used to come quite a bit here. A long time ago, 98 to 2001. But I have not forgotten Finland, actually. I was foreign minister then for a few years, 7 years, 2001, 2008, and minister of other things in Andorra. And I had at that time also a lot of contact with your country. So it's a pleasure to be back and to share this table with the Minister of Defense, who's doing a great job for your country, and also with the other distinguished panelists and other friends that I've met through Liberal International. Liberal International is a federation of 120 political parties worldwide. It's quite an important body in the world. We're not the biggest international. The other formations, the socialists and the conservatives, are slightly bigger. But I think we are the most compact. We have strong discussions within Liberal International, but we always come to quite a few agreements on matters of policy. And we are very strong, I would say, allow me just this, start on issues of human rights, where we have quite a common voice, and particularly at the United Nations, where we do work quite often, where we issue some statements. So for you who are not familiar sometimes with Liberal International, please check us out, check our statements to the UN and see what line we take on certain issues. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this issue, the European common voice. Should this happen? Has it happened? Will it happen? And particularly in a world that is becoming multipolar. By chance, yesterday, when I was flying over, I was reading this article in the Financial Times by Edward Luce that says, "Uncertainty, not China, is replacing US power." And Mr. Luce contends the following, and I will just quote him directly. He says that China is not about to replace the US as the world superpower. And then he says, after America comes multipolarity, not China, he says. The question is, what type? Will it be based on a system of US-framed global rules, or will it be, après moi, le déluge, right? And then he continues later on in his article, which I found quite interesting. The US is behaving like a declining hegemon and willing to share power, yet unable to impose outcomes. And he talks a lot about the US and China and Russia, whatever, but no mention of the European Union. And one wonders why there is no mention at all of the European Union when somebody addresses basically something as important as this sliding into a world that is becoming multipolar. So this multipolarity subject is something that actually is producing a lot of written word and a lot of talk and whatnot. It's in the air, let's put it this way. And in this world of multipolarity, how does Europe behave? Now, we have in the European Union, I say we have, although my country, Andorra, is not a member of the European Union, but we feel close. We have in Europe, in the European Union, the common foreign and security policy. Now, the issue about the common foreign and security policy, Minister Haglund talked about it, is that it's an intergovernmental cooperation. Mm-hmm. It's not supranational. You know, you have the High Representative who represents that policy or whatever, but every single decision at the European level is taken by consensus, basically, on this. And it's very hard to arrive at a consensus on foreign and security policies when the member states of the European Union have all such marked and independent and strong and forceful foreign policies themselves, and that sometimes contradict each other very much. Now, let me just mention, that, of course, the European Union has had a few successes, in terms of, initiatives for a common foreign and security policy. You have, for example, the initiative, the peacekeeping forces in Macedonia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2003, the establishment in 2007 of 15 battle groups, which all have, quite a number of people, etc. The mediation, if you can talk about it, although that's, debatable, by the President of France at the end of the Russian-Georgian military conflict. So, and where there were 200 monitors, peace monitors, that were sent by the European Union to help enforce the ceasefire in the disputed territories and all that. But you have had also high-profile events in the last few years that have showcased the difficulty in having a joint foreign policy and security policy of the European Union. One, of course, of the most well-known ones is the Iraq War. Now, I was a foreign minister back then of my country, Andorra, and we had the first demonstration, the biggest demonstration ever in our history, in the streets of Andorra la Vella, our capital, because of this Iraq War. And we had to take a position, the government, and of course we were surrounded by two big neighbors, and in Finland what it is to have big neighbors, of course, France and Spain. And France and Spain, just to take an example, had opposite, but completely opposite positions on the Iraq War. Opposite to the point of belligerent opposite, right? Not just no. So you had this dichotomy in Europe between what the United States of the time called the New Europe and the Old Europe on the Iraq War, that if you want a better example of an important issue where the European Union has not been able to have its act together, that's clearly one. So I saw it with my own eyes with our neighbors, but it was clear everywhere that this was a very difficult moment for the European Union. Now, you mentioned that I was ambassador. I was also ambassador to the UN for many years. I've been following the UN matters very, very closely. And one of the issues at the UN that has been intractable, for example, not a major issue, well, it can be considered a major issue, is the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations. Now, take that as another example. Does Europe have a joint policy on the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations? Absolutely not. And although sometimes they try to make statements that go in certain ways or whatever, if you look at what the countries, the way they behave, of course, you have two of them that are, the United Kingdom and France, that are members of the Security Council, and the others that are not. And the interests are very divergent. So in that particular debate, no consensus. Of course, at the United Nations, the European Union has statements from time to time to which it, joint statements on issues of the environment and some issues of human rights and all that. But on matters of security and matters of foreign policy itself, at the United Nations, Europe is not one voice. On the contrary, I have had and I have seen ambassadors of European countries lobby other nations, such as mine, in completely opposite directions and in completely undiplomatic ways, I would say also. So the level of animosity, the level also of competition for certain posts or whatnot at the UN is such that you think, excuse me, if this is the European Union, maybe it works in other matters, but in those matters of having a common voice, we're not there. We're not there for the big issues like Iraq. We'll see whether we're there for the Ukraine. But we're not there also for other issues of international cooperation at the UN level, where each of the member states has its own policy. Now, on the Ukraine, of course, I am not an expert, and the thing changes every day, so I asked my predecessor. My predecessor as president of Liberal International was Hans van Balen, who was a colleague of Carl Haglund. He's a member of the European Parliament. And I sent him a message and said, please, Hans, could you please update me on how Europe is basically now facing the issue of the Ukraine? And he has just sent me 5 minutes ago an email, so I will just read it to you directly, so from the European Parliament. My predecessor, Hans, says the following, the EU Foreign Affairs Council wants international independent, maybe OSCE monitors in the whole of the Ukraine to monitor and observe the May 25th presidential elections in the Ukraine. All right, well then. The EU wants Russia to actively put pressure on the separatists to cease violence. So there's a policy of the EU towards Russia to put pressure on the separatists to cease violence. That means, of course, to execute the four-party agreement, US, Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. Now, both the European Union and the US, as Minister Haglund said, have a whole range of personal sanctions on those individuals, the Ukrainians and the Russians, who are involved in the annexation of the Crimea and the troubles in eastern and southeastern Ukraine. Of course, I understand that the US sanctions are a bit deeper than the ones imposed on those individuals by the European Union, but you will correct me if I'm wrong on that. Now, these sanctions, of course, could be deepened and broadened, so that's a possibility that the European Union can take as a matter of policy. NATO and the EU should make clear by exercises that the NATO treaty area will be protected against foreign aggression. NATO-EU should not militarily intervene in Ukraine, but put pressure on Russia, and more economic sanctions against Russia are in the making. So, this seems to be, at least that's what my colleague and friend Hans tells me from the European Parliament today. But as I say, I come from a country that is not a member of the European Union, so I expect Minister Haglund to know much more of the situation right now. Now, let me just quickly also talk about the European Union relation towards these poles in the multipolar world that we have. And basically, the United States, Russia, and China. Now, of course, the United States is the first trading partner of the European Union. And the United States is also the first major ally in security matters of European countries, those who are in NATO, of course, and also those who are not in NATO, but who are close. And one of the issues in the future is whether Europe wants to, if Europe wants to have a single voice, say, in security matters, whether that will mean a distance with the United States or not. That's a major issue because all of the construction, post-World War II construction in Europe in terms of security has been, at least in Western Europe and after the fall of the Berlin Wall expanded to Eastern Europe, has been in relationship with the United States and together with the United States. So, of course, having a single security voice does not mean that Europe needs to go against the United States, but it might mean a certain degree of distance in terms of decision-making or whatnot. So that's one issue that we should talk about. What does it mean if we want Europe to actually play a role in the multipolar world? Does it mean a distance or not with the United States? Now, in terms of Russia, it's a bit more complicated, of course, after and you are much more expert than I could ever be here in Finland of dealing with your Russian neighbor. But, there's been now, of course, the Ukraine that concentrates our efforts. But before the Ukraine, there was another issue, it was Georgia, right? And what can we learn from what happened in Georgia and the position that the European Union had then and the United States then? So that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, energy, the energy policy of Europe with Russia, and whether Europe will continue to be so dependent on energy from Russia, and how will this energy go towards Europe? That means physically, right? Through the Ukraine, through different other places and whatnot, and that is an issue that concerns Finland also very, very much, of course. There's a third issue that has been brought to the attention of people because of Russia's insistence now that culturally Russia is a different kind of place than Western Europe. That's an old debate, but that's a debate that people should talk about. Is it Russia Europe or is it not? Culturally, is it anchored in Western European values historically or not? Well, there seems to be two faces of Russia, right? So that's a very interesting issue for the future. And then finally, sorry, it took a bit longer than you probably wanted me to. China. Now, China is now the second trading partner of the European Union. The European Union, of course, wanted China to become a member of the World Trade Organization. It helped China become a member of the World Trade Organization, but it has had high-profile disputes with China within the World Trade Organization. China does not seem to engage, or maybe correct me there if you think I'm wrong, as much as a global player in terms of security policy, except, of course, in its own area. So it's becoming quite a regional hegemon, that's frightening a lot of people in that area, but maybe at the world stage, not yet. And we see it also in its position to positions of the United Nations. But in terms of trade, of course, for Europe, it is a major concern and a major issue to consider in the future. And then finally, of course, there is the question of the neighborhood policy of the European Union, and then beyond the neighborhood policy, Iran, Iraq, and whatnot. Finally, let me just say that one thing that is quite clear, I think, in this world that we live now is that domestic politics are not separated from international politics. And it will be very important for Europe, if it wants to speak in a common voice, to first have also its act together domestically. And I'm talking here about issues of employment, a strong middle class, etc., things that make a cohesion for the European Union. There's too much divergent voices now in the European Union, also domestically. A lot of populism in many countries of the European Union against the European idea, more than we have seen sometimes in the past. And that doesn't help, of course, to go outside and have a joint voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Again, I have a list of questions, and hopefully some in the audience are already ready with your own. Before we go there, though, let's have comments from Hannah Smith. She's a researcher, and I think I'm going to get the order right now. University of Helsinki, Alexandra Institute, Center for Russian and East European Studies. Correct?
Correct.
Yes. So Hannah, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very honored to be in this panel. Since I am sitting in this panel, I expect that my job is to bring Russia very strongly into this picture. The topic of the seminar is, I was quite intrigued when I opened the attachment where this multipolarity concept was taking up, because first of all, since as a very, very long background on Russia research, in 1990s, multipolarity was the concept that Russia took it as a center of its foreign and security policy, in fact. Argued very, very strongly that this is what world is now after the fall of the Soviet Union. And very, very strongly as Russia was arguing for multipolarity, that the West was not seeing the world in those kind of terms. But now we start to see the world in multipolarity terms also, which is rather interesting development on its own. But also if you look at it from international relations studies perspective, multipolarity is the concept which makes the world most unstable, in fact. In bipolar world, people saw it that, yes, there is a great powers deciding, there is spheres of influence, there is zero-sum game, but it is a certain level stable. And multipolarity in world history has always seen as more unstable. And that, of course, brings a rather interesting challenge also when looking at it from the EU's perspective in that way. Interestingly also it is that EU is the entity in this, perhaps in the multipolar world, that criticizes itself almost the most. China, if that's one polar, not necessarily. Russia, definitely not. US, not too often. EU, all the time. And this is quite and kind of as a starting point in this multipolar world, and looking at perhaps EU even with its other neighbors, specifically, of course, with Russia. Russia's tendency is to use all the criticism it hears that EU expresses itself and multiply it by 10 and then use it in the political context. So in that way, it is an excellent thing that if we start to talking about that and prior to the EU elections and so on. And then looking at it more extensively, perhaps, this Russia aspect is that it seems to be forgotten quite often in Europe that Russia has always been the one that has affected and shaped the European security architecture. One way or another, whether we want it or not, in the background, it's always been there. And in that way, EU started, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, also shaped this idea that Russia would be integrated into Europe. That was the trend and tendency in the 1990s. Today, that's not anymore what we're talking about it. But at the same time, when we had this integration idea, the common foreign and security policy, where common Russia policy was actually in the center. And for in the beginning of 2000, mid-2000, it was quite often analyzed that it's impossible almost to get this one voice. We would need to have it, but it is impossible. I, for one, have been in those circles in that time, 2005 and 2006, searching for the one voice, how that would be kind of found. And then the solution, in one way, was this external kind of foreign and security policy services, where then Baroness Ashton was chosen as a head. At the time, when it was created, it looked as an excellent idea, also from the Russia research point of view, because it was definitely one of those. Russia was always the one who mocked EU by the fact that who do we want to call when we want to talk to Europe, when there would need to be a number. Then when they got the number, they never called. And that's actually the interesting thing, that since 2009, possibly the tendency started slightly earlier, but I don't actually think so, the bilateralism in Russia-EU relations started actually take over the EU-Russia relations. There are other aspects, definitely, which are affecting on this, but still Georgia came up in 2008. EU's role, in fact, was rather large in solving the Georgia conflict. Both OSCE, but definitely it was more kind of personalized. It was Sarkozy, it was the personalized connections, but it was the EU foreign ministers who worked very hard on getting the conflict fast over. Now, in this conflict, we don't have as strong role for the EU, and the conflict seems to be just getting longer and longer. And one of the aspects, I suppose, which we always seem to forget when we look at Russia is that the center of Russian foreign policy has always been the great power identity, craving for status. And Russian argument is that it's never been given. In the West, the argument is, how many times do we need to give the status to Russia before they are happy? And this is something that I'm sure that will become even in a researcher kind of center now. Even in North America, they start to look at the meaning of status much, much more. And in that way, I think that a more clever, perhaps, approach towards Russia will solve something. Whether it will make this conflict to go away, I'm not so sure. But nevertheless, it will in the future. We need to choose whether we want a more kind of aggressive Russia next to us or more cooperative. And naturally, very much here, mentioned already that the domestic politics play in the role. In Russia's case, even more so. And that way, we need to take that into a strong consideration in that way. And domestic politics, in that way that already mentioned here, that in last November it was unexpected withdrawal. And here I would need to say that perhaps in some circles, but if you looked at it from the East, it was not. Most of the people already in Ukraine, if you talk to those who knew something, said, we're never going to sign that. In Russia, the attitude was clearly in that way tilting that we are never going to allow that to happen. And so once the November arrived, that would have been more surprise if, in fact, that would have been signed. And that shows quite strongly how important it is, from the EU's perspective, to learn to know the neighbors in domestic political terms. Not only what's the kind of common interest in a trade or cultural aspects or cooperation like that in intelligence, whatever, but what is going on in the domestic politics and how they play a role in that way. So in one way I could kind of to sum up this thing is that the assessment of the East, what we still probably have is the Wild East, and the assessment of the Eastern domestic political issues is going to be essential. The challenge of how do we deal with this Russian great power identity, which today shows rather aggressive signs completely. And then perhaps we are not needing the common one voice, but we need more coordinated policy, which always helps then to also show a more kind of united line when it comes to those next to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. I am going to run out of ink or lead in my pencil, I think. But let's start, since multipolarity has been mentioned a number of times. Of course, I'm glad that Hanna brought up the academic side, because that's what I started thinking about. Unipolarity, bipolarity, and also, I guess, multinodality. And the reason I say that, it's a slightly newer term, but the major change is that if multipolarity usually is treated as something that states are involved in, the idea of nodes would reflect a little bit more the multiple different actors, non-governmental, such as ELF, to then less positive non-governmental actors, as well as the kind of more networked world. But I'd like to start first with EU developments and inside. There are multiple poles within Europe, I would say, vis-a-vis foreign policy, which have come up, but also regarding values. And now since we're here at the behest of an organization that sees values as something very central to it, I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts on whether or not the kind of multipolarity or polarization of values within the EU is a good or bad thing, and will it serve as a brake to have common policies? How do you agree on even some basic human rights, in which way to communicate about them, what the EU's role should be in them? So is it a problem that Hungary and Sweden view certain minorities differently, for instance?
Well, first of all, I must say that the experience I have working both within the Council and also in the European Parliament, this is, in my view, not sort of the core of the so-called problem, where I see the problem more being the fact, which was mentioned by my fellow panelists before, the fact that many strong countries within the European Union has a urge to do their own foreign policy. And I would still say that that is sort of the big issue. But still, we have seen discussing values fairly severe conflicts within the European Union, where, for instance, Hungary has been playing a fairly central role with its own domestic policies over the years just have passed that have caused a lot of difficult debate. I would, however, claim that when we look at the EU as an entity or as a whole, this is not the issue as such. But it's not been easy to handle this Ukraine crisis either. We have a group of countries that have been far more tough and wanting to be far tougher on Russia, mainly Baltic countries, to a certain extent, Sweden, Poland, UK, while others have been a little more reserved and not too eager to take these tough positions that don't, in our view, lead to anything constructive, rather to a polarization. And hence, we do see this, and this played out, and this is also a very good example why we are still failing, because we can't, it's very bad for the European Union where we are in a situation where the foreign ministers or the council, even on a heads of state level, meet, discuss, for instance, how to handle the Ukraine issue, and then formally speaking, we come to a common conclusion with a common statement from the foreign ministers, but then we have media leaks only some hours or minutes after the meeting where we know that some countries wanted this and some countries wanted that, and then you sort of lose the common front, and all of a sudden the most interesting news is not what the Council wanted Russia to do or the US to do or the United Nations to do in this crisis, but rather we're discussing which countries wanted to punish Russia more and which countries wanted to punish Russia less. And that is sort of the political interesting part of the outcome of the meeting. And we saw this now a few times, and here we do need to do a whole lot better if we want the European Union to be a credible player in relation to to Russia, in relation to China. And this article, which Julie quoted before, where European Union wasn't mentioned, is more or less what I'm looking for. The fact that if in the future the European Union wants to be a key player, we're going to have to get our act together in this respect. And unfortunately, I think we're quite far from that, even though we're on the right track, as I said before.
Well, visual values. Let me just, before I go into values, but I can go into values through identity. Because I think one of the main difficulties in the European Union is that of identity, of a European identity. And that relates also to the border of the European Union, right? You know, Carl was saying, well, some countries, like the Baltic states, whatever, wanted to be stronger on Russia, others didn't. But of course, you know, if you live in Porto, in Portugal, or you live in Dublin, or whatever, Russia is a bit further. And the problem is the identity of the Portuguese and the Irish and the Brits and the French is still very much related to what they are, French and Irish and Portuguese or whatever, and to their borders, their historical borders that are just over there. And it's harder to see beyond. And of course, the governments in those countries will play to their domestic constituencies, also in foreign policy. So it's very hard as long as we don't have a certain European identity that is really there. And it's not there. I don't see it, at least. I see the Erasmus and people now travel and people feel more European and all that, but it's not yet there. We don't have a common European identity in spite of the Ode to Joy and the European flag and all that. And it's hard for a lot of European citizens to see their involvement in certain issues in the world that do not concern their own borders and their own little identity. Now, through values, we have tried to construct a European identity since World War II, right? I mean, because before that, we couldn't really say that Europe was that high on certain values. I mean, we had, after all, one of the most awful wars, and quite a few awful wars, before and all that, and not the best history in colonial terms also and whatnot. But since World War II, after the disaster of World War II, we said, okay, you are building Europe. It's a Europe of values. We value the human being. We value the liberal values, actually, the human rights, and we're going to be a force for good in the world and all that. And around this human rights, the Council of Europe and the idea that Europe is a community that looks forward, that is more advanced, that is actually leading in the world in terms of all these values, we can build a common identity. Now, of course, this also sometimes is floundering now, because you have certain different interpretations in Europe itself about these post-World War II values that we so cherish. So I will leave it at that, but I think it's an issue of also of identity that we don't have a common European foreign policy and security policy.
You put me in a rather difficult spot, I have to say now. I mean, in looking at, because again, I'll approach this from the East, since this is the stronger part. And you yourself mentioned the Russian discussion of who we are we Europeans or are we something else? And when looking at it, the Russian discussion, in fact, to me, it is clear that there is a European identity. And that's the rather interesting aspect, perhaps, here, in the way that there are, because identity is a multiple layer issue, in the way that I have a very, very strong Finnish identity. I'm a Finn. If I go to UK and there is a party where there is people from Scandinavia, then suddenly there is a Nordic identity. We might meet up and we make a couple of jokes about the Brits or something like that, and so on. But if you go to US, then even those who are from Italy or Greece or Porto from Portugal are suddenly those who you hang around because, hey, we are the Europeans. And to me, at least, that has been quite clear that there is a multiple layer in the way that you have your national identity, and all of those countries who are anyway in the EU have one way or another see themselves as the Europeans. There is a strong, in that way, a European identity, and that it is such a strong one that from the East, they do want to join that identity. They want to find that identity in themselves. And in historical terms, in cultural terms, that actually might be possible. But where I see it, that the problem does come, is what of Charlie's question is the value question. In the way of how you build up your state system, which are those values you accept to live in and are kind of more natural to you. And that might be sometimes even difference inside of the EU, not necessarily the fact, from my perspective, that there isn't that European identity. But it is the thing that you kind of look at it in the way that what type of a politics or value questions you accept. And here, in that way, because you can see that also in the EU's Russia policy. The recent research has shown that actually we do have much more common than we think. But because of this thing that I mentioned in the beginning, that we are very easily criticizing ourselves, where are our failures in the first of all, we forget sometimes to look at the strengths, those things that actually unite us. And this is perhaps the weakness sometimes in the EU's Russia policy. And in that way, one could say that certain identity is lost. It is there, but we just need to bring it up and not say that that might be our weakness, because clearly since the Second World War, the European identity is quite strong, and even in historical terms, when looking at it outside Europe, not necessarily inside. And that's kind of, families, when they discuss, they find all kind of faults from each other, but if you need to talk about it to outside, then suddenly you kind of are much more prone to show a good front. And then last point about the value aspect is that here also I would put Russia still in the European club. And Russia has much more European identity than anything else in overall. If you look at it from China, they would never accept Russia to come to the Asian side. They laugh usually if you kind of start talking about this Russian identity discussion when you look at it from that east side. Russia themselves, of course, they have to have it, but it is very much down to their state system, because that is the thing that comes from the East. It is created the more kind of authoritarian traditions in the state system, in the state identity, that comes from the East. Not so much, and well, there is attempts, but in basically the biggest history, the state system, the administrational system comes from the East. But cultural terms and the way how people want to anyway belong to and see themselves is more kind of the European. And this needs to be, I think, remembered very strongly, that the value system, the state system, state identity is the thing that divides us very, very strongly today, not necessarily the European identity aspect. Sorry.
Thank you. Before I go to the first round of questions, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question and comment. You mentioned that we criticize each other easily. Save the Children came up with its latest ranking of best places to be a mother, and the top 14 were all from Europe. And if you looked at almost any other similar study, I would venture to guess that within the top 20, 75% tend to be from Europe. But yet we criticize because everything is very horrible, both in Finland and in Europe and so on. So a good reminder. In terms of identity creation, I remember 5 years ago in lectures there were lots of calls for a need for a European place to discuss European level policies across borders and so on. And it occurs to me that in fact we could maybe borrow something from a different field than politics in terms of creating a strong identity. There's I'll call them a tribe, for the lack of a better word, which is about 100 million people strong. It's relatively new, although the fundamental organization is older. They're Manchester United fans, and they're around the world, and if you ask the true fans, they would probably identify with being a Manchester United fan, and to some degree, values that they may espouse regarding teamwork. This is why the anti-racism campaign is particularly good and well the way it's done. And they managed to do it, but there's some passion in it, as opposed to, I would say, looking at most communiques or others from Brussels, there's a little less passion. So at least it's possible to include and develop a new identity. As far as values, and this comes to my question then, I agree with Hannah that we maybe are blinded by physical state borders of where values and identity come and how much we share or Russians share with us. Then if you go to the other side, you get to the US and transatlantic relations. One of the biggest policy concerns in the last year or two has been the US is leaving us. They're pivoting to Asia and so on. I think it's wildly overblown. But could this still open the door, not just for European security, but more broadly foreign policy independence to some degree? Should we be thankful to the Americans and Obama if they actually were to do this, which I don't think they will?
Well, first of all, going back to the Second World War and even before, it's clear that Europe has been mentally very dependent on the US in many ways. And I see this very much within the defense sector, where the structure of NATO and the way NATO works Europe is far too dependent on the US, which is something that the US and everyone is very much aware of, and where this has been one of the driving factors for a more intensified European defense cooperation, which is not in conflict with NATO, on the contrary. But we also see this on a political level, and I also think that it's widely, let's say, overemphasized that the US is so to speak, leaving Europe behind and focusing on Asia. The crisis in Ukraine will probably, first of all, change that a little again, but second of all, it might be good for Europe. We, for instance, have the defense policy issues, but also overall, it might be good for Europe to take a discussion at some point, realizing the fact that we have a situation in Ukraine. This is also going back to where I started out. We have a discussion and situation in Ukraine, and suddenly Russia wants the US to be a central partner in the discussion, rather than it would have been a fairly natural scenario, for instance, in Geneva, to discuss on a basis where you would have the European Union, Ukraine, and Russia. But the Russians insisted on having the US at the table, which is rather odd in a sense, and still explains and symbolizes the role of the US in Europe still today in 2014. Even though we shouldn't be too good at criticizing ourselves, that is still a fact that we need to at some point evaluate. One other issue which is very interesting, which is not the topic of today, but one thing that we might want to discuss, which Julie partially touched upon, is the United Nations. What has been the role of the United Nations in the Ukraine conflict so far? Extremely limited. They are, practically speaking, doing nothing. So I'm not going to go into the UN internal reform, because I don't believe there will be a reform. But anyway, we can see that we are still, in this crisis, we still see a sort of situation where we're going back in history, where this US-Russia relation and this Cold War scenario type of thinking is doing a comeback, which at least I hadn't expected. And the EU, United Nations, etc., being partially sidestepped. So we'll see what that brings along for the future, and how much that will affect also the will within the European Union to do more over the years to come. Then personally, I don't believe in, even though I think it's good to try to work with identity within the European Union, I, however, don't believe that we politically can decide, or even I'm also partially skeptical with this identity work the Commission from time to time and some others are trying to work on, sort of creating a European identity, because it has to come from below. It's not going to work as a top-down project. And some tend to think that it will be sort of enhanced by top-down thinking. I personally don't believe that.
So no EU soccer team in Brazil World Cup?
Well, interesting idea. You spoke about Manchester United. I prefer Manchester City, so I'm not even going to go there. So,
just so you know, I'd like to hear two other panelists' comments on this. Mr. Haglund needs to leave in about 10 minutes or 15 or so. Yes. So right after these comments, I'll open the floor, especially if you have comments directed at him.
Yes, Julie, please go. Just to say that I actually agree with Carl that this issue of identity cannot come from top down at all. You know, it wouldn't work. You know, it has to be from the citizens. But we have to also think: what are the citizens of our respective countries? What are they basically able and willing to support in terms of foreign policy? And you know, as far as now, I think they relate their foreign policy to their national foreign policies. They don't relate the citizen on the ground, a strong foreign policy with the European Union. I wanted to also comment one little thing on decision-making mechanisms, because we go beyond all this talk about values and identity and whatnot. I mean, the decision-making mechanisms of the European Union, as advanced as they are now after the Lisbon Treaty and the intergovernmental consultations for, like, you know, all these foreign policy and foreign security policy, it's still, the issue is still, who do you call when you need to get something done at the European Union? And I have a bit of experience with that, you know. I negotiated the agreements of Andorra with the European Union. And of course, I had many meetings with the Commission and with, you know, and some of them were complicated, you know, the savings withholding tax agreement and whatnot. Now, at the end of the day, and now it's been a few years, so I don't think I give away any secret, but at the end of the day, I got much more done by phoning the different colleagues from the different national countries and having one of them or two of them, you know, or going to see the president of the Italian presidency of the European Union or whatever, and getting things through that way, than by endless meetings in Brussels that, you know, we're all like about this line and that other line. So as long as you can negotiate with the Union by going through the national countries that compose it, it's very difficult to see a strong union that has a foreign policy, that you can actually finalize agreements and sign them. And that's the experience, of course, you know, limited experience of a small nation dealing with particular agreements. So, you know, it could be probably nullified by others saying, oh no, this doesn't happen for this or that. But still, it's my experience. So I do share it with you guys, you know.
I'll comment, I mean, quickly again, this coming back to the European identity aspect, is shortly only, Eurovision Song Contest is actually a good example of it, that how many wants to be part of the European identity as such. But then coming to why Russia insisted on US having in Geneva, I would like to at least make an attempt to answer to it. One is actually that this multipolarity concept is in Russia now also being debated in the way that, is this actually a good idea or not? The better idea might actually be, because of the rise of China, which actually Russia is afraid of also, that Russia and US would be the great powers again, who decide quite a lot. So therefore, in Russia's interest, is it also to bring US into Europe very, very strongly. This has changed. It wasn't in kind of 5-6 years ago quite the same yet, but it has changed now. So on top of that, in domestic politics, because of this great power identity aspect, which has been brought in so strongly by the Russian leaders and bringing Russia back to the global world as such, it is also the best framework to show that Russia is strong when it is together with the US. And then the final aspect, which is actually also rather interesting, is that it seems so that Russia is a little bit worried about the voices inside of the EU who do want to hit Russia, put it bluntly, in the way that if they get a too strong voice, now when perhaps Russia views EU as slightly weaker than it has been before, it is very, very worried that what might be the outcome. And therefore, US, again, seems to be a rather good talking partner in this case. The problem, of course, is that US is still other side of the Atlantic and not necessarily so much kind of hands-on in this conflict, and that brings a new kind of flavor for the overall picture, definitely, and always more problems when great powers just talk with each other about one country, and not necessarily in a more kind of a bigger roundtable, King Arthur style of a roundtable discussions.
Great, thank you. Let's start the first set of questions. Gentleman here. Please wait, we'll give the microphone so that the webcast can also hear you.
One point about Ukraine. According to material which was handed out in this place a while ago, Ukraine is a region which is politically split into East and West. And now, okay, about the West, I only know that they are wildly wanting to be European and that they are mostly agrarian. Perhaps they dream of the financial support for the agriculture from the EU and the way other EU countries get it. whereas East Ukraine has this industry from Soviet times and is reasonably proud of it and rightly worried about the future of this industry if Ukraine would join the EU, because the market is Russia and White Russia, and it's very doubtful whether the products would be marketable in the EU. So if both sides have strong wishes and rightful worries, why is East Ukraine not represented at the negotiation table? I think it would be a very good step to give them a voice, because they have legitimate worries.
Okay, thank you. Others? I'll take two more.
Dear friends, my name is Krista Hummelstedt. I've been active in politics since the 1960s, when I started as president of the Liberal Students Club in my hometown, 2 hours west of here in Turku. Your Excellency, dear JULI, you're in a way a very special guest here today, so I must mention for you present here that this year Andorra will issue euro coins of their own. They are part of the Eurozone. So I think that's a big symbolic step. And also, which is a more difficult matter, you will introduce income tax, I understand. And I think Andorra is the perfect place to school, to bring up diplomats. And we have one perfect diplomat here in front of us, JULI MINOVES, who has negotiated both in Madrid and New York and Paris and many other places, and Brussels. Well, anyhow, my question, I cannot, as the theme is multipolarity. Many years ago, I put this question to the then Commissar of the European Union, Erkki Liikanen. Where does Europe end? And mind you, that was a long time ago, so we were talking about the Caucasus and the Ural Mountains and stuff like that. But today, after Ukraine, does Europe end, if we look 50 years forward or 100 years forward, does Europe end at Crimea or Eastern Ukraine, or where does the potential of the European Union end? And finally, I completely agree with you, JULI, about your point on European identity. Not even in South America, with only two dominating languages, Portuguese and Spanish, they have accomplished a complete, real South American identity in the same sense like in the United States. But where does Europe end?
All right, I think we'll take those. Or was there? We'll take one more question, so we'll have 3 broader questions.
Thank you. My name is Carl Fredrik Geust. I would like to take up some points of HANNA, but I think unfortunately European Union has lost more than 10 years period for during which confident and trustworthy relations with Russia could have been built. I had personally the privilege of working as a European expert in Moscow right after Finland became a member of the Union in 1995. At that time, President Yeltsin declared Europe is our joint home. It sounds like a dream today. And the European TASIS program was very vast technical assistance to the CIS countries, and there was a wide contact surface on mid-level, both officials, universities, startup companies. One of the startup companies is now the big megaphone company, and so on. I think the contact surface of the European specialist was much wider than ever of the diplomats. The European specialists had access to mid-level people who are not accessible today in similar positions, but those people 15, 20 years ago, they are now on a high level. They are the decision makers, and they since when the TASIS program was naturally phased up, there was no one in the European Union, no mechanism, no persons taking up that collective experience and the contacts. And now the decision makers, speechwriters on both central and local level, they think that Europe is not longer interested in us. There's no one calling us. We have given 20 years ago our telephone numbers. No one is calling.
Thank you. If we start with Mr. Haglund first, and then I understand you will probably have to run away.
Yes, unfortunately, I have some obligations I need to handle still this afternoon that doesn't allow me to stay until 5. I'm very sorry about that. But anyway, going back to the excellent questions. First of all, concerning having Eastern Ukraine at the negotiation table, first challenge being who represents Eastern Ukraine, because we don't have a federal state, so there is no democratic order of choosing some sort of negotiation partner there. That's one challenge. Another challenge being that these separatists are far from organized. Some of them are not even Ukrainian, they're Russians. Some of them are local population, but they are acting on their own. Some might be acting together with others in other parts of other cities in Eastern Ukraine. So it's not an organized movement or a group that could actually represent them all together. If that would be the case, if there would actually be a joint movement and a democratic one, it would be easier, but in this case, it's impossible to identify. If they would actually be a movement you could negotiate with, I think it would be in everyone's interest to have a discussion or a debate or a dialogue with them, especially a dialogue, in order to try to come to a sensible solution without violence, because now we're seeing something that is more and more looking like a civil war. And it's clear that some weeks ago, both the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev and also Moscow felt that they had some sort of control on what was happening on their own part, and now it seems that no one has the control anymore. And it was a little ironic when the Russians first said from Moscow that they have nothing to do with the separatists, and then a few days later they said that they can't control them anymore. Point being that it's clear that the Russians have had their part in starting these different occupations, etc. But it's also clear that we now have also some spontaneous activities. We also have this right-wing fascist movement. We have the events in Odessa, etc. that are very tragical. So this is far from under control, and this is extremely worrying also in the light of trying to solve this situation through negotiations. Concerning this question of Krista Hummelstedt, where does the borders of Europe lie, or where does Europe end? My rhetorical question would actually be that, do we actually need to define that? Some of us might, from geographical or other points of views, want to sort of draw some borderlines. I would, however, argue that it's not very fruitful at this point in time to try to define something that we later on might have to review. Going back to the Arab Spring, which you interestingly enough called the Arab War, which is now looking back maybe a better term, but we did try to call it the Arab Spring for a long time. we very clearly then defined that at least Northern Africa will probably never have even a chance to become a part of the European Union. But at the same time, also going back to what Susanne Hartig said in the beginning, we have countries that still are in the process of, at least in the long run, becoming members of the European Union. It will probably take a fairly long time before Croatia will stop being the newest member in the club. But anyway, in the long run, we do need to keep our doors open for a lot of countries, and Ukraine will be one of them, in theory at least. Whether this will be reality then remains to be seen. But I'm a little skeptical in trying to define borders, even though we have some geographic, fairly natural borders that most likely will be seen as borders someday. And finally, concerning question by Mr. Geust, I think you're completely right. I mean, even though it's not very fruitful to blame the European Union for what has happened in Russia over the past years since Putin came back as president, and it's not probably fruitful either for the European Union to blame itself for the association agreement failure with Ukraine. But at some point in time, we do need to evaluate why the Eastern Partnership on a formal level and also other activities didn't work out too good, especially if we want to, in the long run, be more successful. And I must say that from a Finnish government point of view, and also as a former Finnish representative to the European Parliament, it was quite frustrating when we were one of the few countries from the EU 15 club that was at all interested in the Eastern Partnership, and countries like France, Germany, Spain, Italy, etc., were very, very uninterested and couldn't, if I may say so, couldn't care less about what was happening with the Eastern Partnership for a very long time. So I guess that the events in Ukraine will at least change that, but how that will then in the long run affect the whole Eastern Partnership policy remains to be seen, because as long as the crisis in Ukraine is on, focus will be on Ukraine. At the same time, I must say, and that's my final point, that we are now very much focused on Ukraine, but the events in Ukraine will show us why we can't afford to fail in any of the other countries in Europe that are still not a part of the European family, and why we need to make sure that we don't fail in Moldova or Montenegro or Serbia, etc. So we do have a lot of work to do, and we shouldn't forget all that work needs to be done over the years to come, even though Ukraine will probably dominate in many ways the coming years, and also the way the Eastern activities within the European Union is viewed, both within the Union and also from an observer point of view. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, I need to go handle some necessities still this afternoon due to my work, but I, on my part, want to thank especially HANNA and JULI and CHARLY for the good discussion so far. I'm sure that the fellow panelists will give you some good inputs in this half hour that is left, and thank you very much for the invitation to come here.
Julie? Hanna?
Yes, well, thank you. Where does Europe end? Well, that's a very interesting question. I've been teaching a course this semester in California at the University of Verne on European politics, and that was a hard question that my students actually asked, you know, because I had to tell them something. And, you know, if you talk about European politics, you need to say, well, what kind of politics? And not only the European Union, but Europe is larger. Now, what I learned in high school back then was that Europe went from the Atlantic to the Urals. That was what they was taught, you know. And it makes certain geographic sense, but not completely. Because in the end, Europe is part of a huge continent. We talk about the continent of Europe, but Europe is not really a continent geographically. You know, it's all Eurasia that is a continent as such, if we are very keen on geographic limits and whatnot. So it is undetermined. We know where it ends on that side, more or less. Well, it goes up to Iceland and maybe Greenland, although it's difficult to know whether Greenland is Europe or not, but it's part of a European country, at least for now. And then the other side is a bit more complicated. And there lies the crux of the matter about Russia, right? And, you know, you were just mentioning, you know, 10 years ago, Russia wanted to see itself as European, like it did a lot in the 18th century, for example, right? But then you also had the 19th century in which Russia saw itself as this kind of like unique mixture of cultures and unique empire and whatnot, you know, which you also find now. So in the Putin administration, this new sense of we are different and now we are recovering the orthodox values and we are a different culture than this Western Europe. So Russia has oscillated in its history in defining itself as European or not. And it is doing that again. So I don't know whether it's us to say whether Russia is European or it's not European. For me, and you said, of course, it's clear that Russia is part of the European family, at least the historical culture, the wars it fought, you know, since the 18th century and whatnot, was with Europe. It was part of the Congress of Vienna. It was part of the realignment of Europe after 1815. Its history is European. You know, it was part of World War I, and like, you know, the Soviet Revolution, the revolution in Russia was obviously also part of that European changing matters. It has been part of the history of Europe. So I think for me it does end there, you know. But where exactly, I don't know. So we'll see in the next few years how Russia itself defines itself. Now, the Ukraine, the split east and west, that's also a complicated issue because, as Carl Haglund said, you know, there's no organized representative of Eastern Ukraine.
Agree on a voice which can then sit at the table.
What I think is that actually Russia should do more at this point, and I agree with Hans and what I read to you from the European Parliament, that Russia should definitely do more to calm that part of Eastern Ukraine. Because if Russia said very clearly that it has absolutely no designs on Eastern Ukraine and that it will not try to, like, you know, change the geography of Ukraine at this point or whatever, and meant it and retreated and whatnot, you know, it would be very different. We wouldn't have, you know, an Eastern Ukraine movement that would be strong enough and feel strong enough to actually push at this point. So I think in this, it's more like in the hands of Russia now to move, rather than us bringing in representatives from Eastern Ukraine that we actually don't know exactly what they represent and who they are, as Carl Haglund was saying. I think it's at this point quite unrealistic. We'll see how the things evolve, but I think it's at this point very difficult to do that. You know, there's a Ukraine, there's a country, there's a state. There are authorities that are there, and there are like the neighboring countries, and one of them is Russia, that should play a bigger role now in calming the spirits in Eastern Ukraine. That's my opinion.
Okay, the Ukraine split, I actually want to say one important thing that cannot be perhaps underlined enough is the fact that since the independence of Ukraine, all the opinion polls which has been taken do not show any strong drift between the East and the West. This is kind of making of these crises. It is very, very much also to do with that there are, of course, differences. Every country has a northern Italy and southern Italy and Bavaria and North Germany. And in that way, if you want to, you can steer up anywhere. So in that way, Ukraine is not a special case. It is the propaganda machinery that has worked on this occasion rather strongly to make the picture of split Ukraine even stronger. But naturally, when violence comes into the picture and there are people do not have enough access to kind of different types of information, then those split, it is possible to also make. There I actually agree in the way that Russia should and could do more. But classically, traditionally, Russia is much better at steering up things than actually fixing things. And now we are in that position. And I'm almost sure that they are slightly kind of thinking of how to actually fix this time, because of the fact that they have also unleashed certain kind of powers that, as they have said themselves, cannot control anymore. The question about Eastern Ukrainian representatives in a table, there in the picture that Defense Minister gave, I think it's a correct, that it's a very, very difficult to know who. But since that has been brought up now, this is what Russia could do. If Russia wants to have Eastern Ukrainian representative in a table, they should find one, since they have come up with the fact also. So, you know, somebody, if this is the succession, then where is the person? Or where are the persons? Kind of more of the people. There possibly is some people who has quite a lot of regional power and could be thought about it. But it is unclear who's Russia thinking in this case. And that should be perhaps figured out. And when coming back to this Russia, I actually believe very, very strongly that Russia still wants to be part of Europe. The things that you refer to, most of us probably are aware of this, that the mystery of Russian soul that you cannot, with the reason, understand. You need to just kind of feel it. The poet Tuchev, who wrote these words in the 19th century, actually, he was a great fan of Europe. He loved to go and flash out in the European cities, be part of those European fancy circles and things, but always felt that he's kind of outsider. So he started writing poetry to explain Russianness to Europeans. And this is the rather interesting aspect, that even the whole debate inside of Russia, whether we are part of Europe or not, or we are a unique entity, is all to do with Russians to wanting to be part of Europe. And that is something that we sometimes actually forget. But then when they get disappointed, where the great power state identity comes to play in the part, they kind of say, sod it, I don't care. Now we are going to do what we want to do, this is what is our, and then they take all the kind of tools that are needed to it. One of them is orthodoxy, of course, to use conservatism, the traditional Russian values. They find it somewhere else. But in 2000, Putin was able to define the Russian values. He said that it's a state-centrism, it's the great powerness, and it's a patriotism. These are not necessarily any kind of different values than many other countries. Great powerness, perhaps, yes. And state-centrism, it is a question about a country, but not in the way that you could define these as a unique things. Now, since I'm writing one article relating to these things, I've been trying to look for how Putin defines Russian values today. And it's not that clear anymore. He does not have a very clear idea. He's searching, he's fishing, he's kind of trying to put together some kind of a compact a package which could be said, this is what is Russian values, this is what Russianness is. But the problem is that it is so anchored to European history and to the desire to be part of Europe that they have difficulties now. Perhaps the confusion, again, has caused this difficulty, what we have. And then the last final comment relating perhaps to this, where does Europe end? I agree, actually, again, with the defense minister in the way that it's not necessarily always a good idea to define it. And as we have seen, borders can be changed quite drastically also, if needs come. So in that way, perhaps Europe is more of the value system, the state identity question, which I brought up earlier, in the way that a lot of countries, if solid, not in the way that they are flexible rules, which has been perhaps adapted or something, but a fixed set, rather kind of harsh way of looking at the state system. That perhaps is Europe in many ways, and then if there is the historical connections, that could already start to be it in that way.
Wow. Thank you for those comments. I'm going to ask on some reflections about what the EU can do. We've heard about the Ukraine, but in other parts of its neighborhood around. And then also take a question or two. I will start with my question to give a few people time to think about them. We already have one. My question, quite simply, is: should the EU be more active? Can it be more active, or are we expecting it to be effectively the United States in terms of what it does in the Middle East, Northern Africa, specifically one could say Syria, Egypt, Israel, Palestine? Or should we just realize that the EU is good at some basic things, rule of law training as an example? And that's an okay role for the EU.
Thank you very much for the wonderful and explicit explanation. I am thinking about Britain, actually, because I know, Hannah, that probably you said you have connection to Britain and then to Finland. I'm wondering, because the big nations in the EU, at some point, it seems that their policies, for instance, Britain, they would like to take back the Anglo-Saxons and the Commonwealth. Recently, UK was reinforcing very strongly the economic potentials they have in the Commonwealth. And I am wondering that if we are building the EU, and then we have the complexities of the different languages spoken in the EU, which is already one of the dividing factors, because if we think about United States and transatlantic, they have strongly only 2 languages. So I'm wondering about the role that these big countries in the EU, how committed they are in building the European identity.
Thank you. Christoph?
So
Yeah.
very briefly. I think Andorra has the solution, the key to our problem. I'm serious now. The motto of Andorra is Virtus Unita Fortior. Unified virtue is stronger. I've read the long Latin at the cathedral school in Turku, so I know a little bit of Latin. But my point is that a union of like-minded, that's an expression that has been used, that should be our goal. And maybe it's malplacé to mention in this connection a thing like the European Song Contest, but it consists of many other countries than the EU countries. And I think in every field, in commerce especially, in culture, in sports, you know, maybe remember the ping pong diplomacy between the United States and China and so on. So in every field where we can, we should have friendly connections with our neighbors. And don't forget this very good motto, Virtus Unita Fortior, unified virtue is stronger. So that will make us strong.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, there's one. Okay, sorry, I didn't see you.
Yes, I got one question. You said that Russia or Putin is more interested in the United States. That's quite clear. And Putin has declared also that he has an own idea about the culture. But the interest in EU, is it more of economical reasons today, considering the Ukraine crisis? Are there more things, or is it more of economical reasons? Because we know that Russia is depending on EU as EU is depending on Russia with gas and oil and so on.
Great. You could have those, and if I can amplify the gas, oil, energy. So any thoughts on also what the EU could or should not do? Should there be a one unified market has been suggested. And we will see how long the answers are. Maybe that the last opportunity to ask questions went, but let's start with Julie.
Thank you very much. Well, I will just refer first to this question that focuses on the union of like-minded in Europe. Thank you for quoting the motto of my country, which is indeed Virtus Unita Fortior. That comes, of course, from a time in which my country, as small as it is, was divided by a civil war in the 13th century, in which the army of the Count of Foix and the army of the Bishop of Urgell, basically were quarreling and signed a pact of peace in the end, and the Andorrans were sort of divided. So the union of virtue and in Andorra has been very important for our country, and for the way we have evolved. Now, this leads me to think that the European Union was founded by 6 member states, and particularly was founded on a very strong core of Franco-German cooperation. And for a long time, it was relatively small, so the deepening could actually go through by this enhancement of this Franco-German cooperation. And you remember that Charles de Gaulle forbid the United Kingdom from joining, and when he went, Pompidou changed his mind and whatnot. But then the United Kingdom joined, and you have, the 3 biggest, countries in terms of population and whatnot: Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. If you had those 3 countries as a very strong core with a like-minded mentality on this foreign policy issue, you would gain a lot already. Of course, you would have to contend with many different positions, and all the other countries are very important too. But that would help. The problem is the core is faltering a little bit. The Franco-German cooperation is still there, but it's not as strong as it used to be. And the British have had waves, let's put it this way. Waves in and waves out. They wanted very much to be in. They got in the 70s. Then in the 80s with Margaret Thatcher, they said, we want our check back. Let's talk about this. The famous Bruges speech of Margaret Thatcher, in which she said, intergovernmental cooperation, fine, nothing supranational, more or less. I'm summarizing, and whatnot. So you don't really have a core. It started with a core, with a strong core. You don't really have it as much now. So I think there you have something. The like-mindedness is not there, at least for this core. And for the other countries, of course, then the Eastern European aspect, which you know much more than I do, there adds also a lot of complexity, also in the terms of values that we were mentioning before. So all that together doesn't make for much of a virtus unita fortiori, I might say. Now, you, madam, you mentioned the question of the languages and the difficulty of the language. So you see, there, I don't know, maybe because in my country we speak several, I've never really seen that as a problem for the European Union. I mean, yes, they need a lot of translators in Brussels for the meetings and all that, but it works. And it works relatively well. And most Europeans know 2 or 3 common languages, and we manage, That I don't see as much a problem as this like-mindedness and this core and this values unity. But maybe I'm wrong. Some people would say, oh, the languages really divide us. I think they don't as much. The issue of certain countries in the European Union having their own set of policy matters with the outside world, like the UK with the Commonwealth, or Spain with the Iberian-American summit meetings, or France with the Francophonie, or whatever, that is complex. But I don't think that is what actually makes the difficulty for a common or joint foreign policy either. Mainly also because in those groupings of countries that come from a time past in which those countries were united under probably the dominant role of these European countries is not there anymore. I mean, in the Francophonie, Canada and Switzerland and whatever in Europe matter as much as or more as France. And in Africa, of course, you have. So it's not like there's a kind of like country that overshadows the other. At least the Francophonie, which I know well. The Iberian American Summit's even less so. You know, I mean, you have Spain, of course, and Portugal, but you also have Brazil and Mexico and whatnot. These countries are not overshadowed by the three European countries that are in the Iberian American Summits. And the Commonwealth, I dare to say that also, right? I mean, in spite of the fact that the Queen of England is queen of many countries within the Commonwealth and is still the head of the Commonwealth for the others that are republics, I mean, India and whatnot, you know, these countries are not going to follow the policies of the United Kingdom just because they have a particular relation with them or whatnot. So I don't see there too much of a problem. The issue of economic issues with Russia and President Putin and the gas issue, well, that of course also showcases a bit of division among Europeans. You know, when it was decided to actually circumvent the Ukraine and Poland to like go to Germany directly and bring the gas there, of course Poland was not happy, obviously. And how do you know, then unite in foreign policy when you have issues like that, you know, are basic economic interest issues for some of the members, big members of the European Union, and they don't really come with a single mind. You know, even in economic matters where the European Union should actually have one voice, and normally has one voice at the WTO or whatever, you have big problems like this one. This is a big problem, a major problem among the member states of the European Union, and it showcases a larger difficulty of getting together for foreign policy.
Okay. Right. Where would I start now? Perhaps I start again from the Russian side. When I said this thing that Putin is more interested in US than Europe, that is a different thing than Russia wanting to be part of the European Union or part of Europe, so to speak. This is more kind of, in fact, now a chosen policy, because the way how Putin started leading Russia from 2012 onwards, he really actually does need now US for being able to implement his policies. In the European framework, that would not work the same way. US is granting, in a Russian perspective, for Russia the great power status it needs, which can be used in a domestic politics in very many ways. So in that way, the way how Putin has chosen US now, it is basically almost for his own survival, because otherwise the policy actually will start slightly shaking. And then coming to the energy aspect, where again in this whole is actually that the Russian bilateral relations with the different EU member states has played a strong role of how the kind of Russian energy policy has been shaped. And it is true that Russia wanted to bypass Ukraine and Poland and Baltic states, Nord Stream. But actually that was rather cleverly done, because very few remember or know that Nord Stream was actually a European project. It was agreed in European Parliament, though prior to the 2004 enlargement. But nevertheless, so here the interesting aspect is that Poland did not accept something that EU had made a decision on before it was a member. So in this way, there are also some other aspects to remember. And now South Stream is basically doing nearly the same, that just when there is a very strong talk inside of the EU of common energy policy or something, and then plop, there is Austria who says, yes, we'll do a bilateral deal with Russia. That is good for us. And then suddenly the common way of looking at it goes slightly differently. But this is something that I do not almost kind of believe that the energy policy can be, it could be better coordinated, but I do not believe that we can ever have, again, the common and coordinated is those two words that need to be played specifically in a EU outside relations, foreign and security policy relations, very strongly. When it comes to then this thing that I'll bring now in perhaps the Great Britain in the way that, since I'm not an expert in Great Britain as such, but yes, I do have some connections to that direction, like the name, for example, not my maiden name. So UK has also that great power identity, which then naturally plays into the domestic politics, again, and very, very strongly in the EU politics. That what the Thatcher did, domestic politics, very much. Again, we can see the Conservative Party has always had more kind of a critical line in certain ways in this. But what has happened and why it is so easy to use this in domestic politics is also this, again, I bring up the self-criticism, in the way that the way how EU has been looked at also in the British politics a lot is this thing that it brings up all the madness and very, very little of the good stuff, which actually is much bigger lot than the madness. And this is perhaps in many other domestic politics a big problem. And that can be seen definitely when looking at from the eastern side also. And then finally, what can EU do? Perhaps the wider world, the way how we're looking at US and things, that's not really the EU's thing. But where EU could, in my perspective, do is the neighborhood bit. And in some ways, even if North Africa is not going to be part of European Union as such, that is close anyway. And there are a lot of European Union members who have an interest on North Africa. So in that way, that's the neighborhood policy aspect, and then turning it towards the east. In that way, there is an awfully lot, and specifically in the east, because there is the desire to be part of Europe. It's not only Russia, it is in fact Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, the Caucasus. Interestingly, even some of the Central Asian countries sometimes talk about that, which is a really big question of whether Europe will end there or not. But nevertheless, so in Turkey's case, the desire to be part again of Europe. So there, where this is existing, then EU could do more. And one of the aspects is the clearer concept, in the way that this, at least from the eastern side, has always been criticized, is that there are awfully lot of many pages, and it's never quite clear exactly what is required, which things needs to be done. So perhaps it would be the less is more in this case, to be a little bit perhaps tougher, but clearer, and then if that kind of approach would start working, then needs to be, of course, thinking of possibly even expanding the EU borders.
All right. Thank you. I'm looking at my watch, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to... One sentence. Hopefully not a run-on one.
While Yeltsin spoke about Europe as our joint home, it seems that Putin's credo or motto is Nash dom, Gazprom. Our home is Gazprom.
But the concept was also, it was Gorbachev who introduced the common European home. And in fact, you can find that also in the 19th century. So it's not quite only the Yeltsin. And even Putin used it in his first presidency. But now, not so much anymore.
Well, very quickly, I'd like to thank both European Liberal Forum, Svenska Bildningsförbundet. I would never try to summarize a panel like this. Hopefully viewers here and around Europe, maybe even world, have gotten some food for their own thinking on Europe or EU in a multipolar world. I was somehow stuck on the idea of also what is Russianness and what is Europeanness, and what European values, identity have to do with it. And to me, maybe it's ideas, in fact, ideas that can flow around the world, that aren't limited by national borders. Sometimes interests core national interest come in the way, a little bit like stones in a stream. But water finds its way around. Guess as a final word of inspiration at least, we've heard about larger European powers maybe being a block here, but the inspiration for this whole roundtable series, as I understand, Ralph Dahrendorf is a perfect example as someone who served in both German and British democratic systems, hopefully pulling all sides closer together. So thank you for coming here, thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the viewers.